And over my lifetime, based on the experiences that I've had, I've tried to figure out, even if it's really rough and maybe not as inaccurate as you'd like it to be, can I create a model of what's going on as a way to create a framework and think about what I'm doing? It gives me a chance to test an idea and evolve my thinking. Now, I didn't give you a screwdriver or a hammer there. What I said was go to the toolbox and look for something that works. But you got to fill the toolbox first.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we have an incredible episode on tap. I'm joined by Admiral Thad Allen, who was the 23rd Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and is renowned for his remarkable crisis management skills. He directed the federal response to Hurricane Katrina, one of the most complex and devastating natural disasters in U.S. history. He also served as the National Incident Commander for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, coordinating the effort to contain and clean up the largest marine oil spill in history. His expertise in crisis leadership has earned him national respect and recognition. Today, we'll discuss what it takes to lead during a crisis and how the skills Admiral Allen developed over his career can help all of us handle difficult situations with resilience and resolve. Stick around, you'll want to hear his invaluable insights. Admiral, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
My pleasure.
Okay, you're a man of action, so let's get right into our conversation. You're known by many for your expertise in crisis management, as I mentioned. If you had to define in simple terms what crisis management is from a leadership perspective, how would you define it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think in general, it's the ability to create the conditions to successfully address a risk, threat, event that has happened, and be able to execute on the actions needed to mitigate the risk. And I like to quote the Constitution and promote the general welfare. It's the ability to see what needs to be done and do it.
That's great. And also, I appreciate you bringing in the Constitution there. That was an unexpected twist. To add to that, there are three types of crises, at least that I'm aware of. The immediate, those are such as natural disasters where there's little or no warning. Emerging, such as cybersecurity threats to institutions and organizations where things are slow in developing, yet often not predictable. And then sustained, and those would be things like the homelessness crisis that we've seen, or COVID-19 pandemic, those things that last longer. Leading crisis situations was such a major part of your career and even continues to be now. For instance, I know you were recently called in to assist with the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. Where does this ability, your ability to lead in crises, come from? Looking back on things, kind of what shaped your approach to handling crises?
Well, I think you gain something from any job or experience you've ever had. I was asked a similar question during the Katrina response, and I noted that every job I'd ever had in the Coast Guard, something occurred, I learned something, or there was some experience that I ended up being able to apply or lean on during the Katrina response. So it's a cumulative experience gathering. I'm a firm believer in lifelong learning, and finally emotional intelligence. As you mature as a human being and you learn how to work with others, learn how to empathize, build teams, deal with what I would call cognitive diversity, you start building a portfolio of skills and talent, and then the challenge is bringing out the right ones when something happens. One of my favorite definitions of leadership is the ability to reconcile opportunity and competency.
That's good. Looking back, I guess there is some recall bias, but in those in those moments when they were occurring, did you recognize, hey, this is something I need to put in my file, or do you think it just sort of accumulated unknowingly almost, and then at some point in time you were able to draw on that?
Actually, I think it's a little of both. I mean, there are times in my life I knew I was in a life changing event just by what was happening. And there are other times you do something, you sit down and you reflect on what's happening, which you should always do. And being able to reflect and kind of do a self study and talk about the elements of what you did, how you decided to do it, bringing those two things together, I think, are what's important. I was involved in a couple of catastrophic responses where you're immediately thrust into it. But afterwards, on reflection, I was able to say, what are the basic tenets that you see in all of these events that you can lean on, almost like doctrine. And doctrine doesn't tell you what to do; it tells you how to think about what you're doing.
Hmm. You, and I think, as I mentioned at the top of the introduction here, led a couple of really high visibility responses. You led the large scale federal response to Hurricane Katrina under, I think anybody would agree, incredibly challenging conditions. Could you share a story from that experience that really kind of encapsulates what crisis leadership means to you?
I sure will. Let me note at the start, though. I was sent down to New Orleans a week after the storm came ashore.
Yes, sir.
The president asked me to go down and assist Mike Brown, the FEMA administrator, and basically focus on New Orleans because there's a general, at least a general perception in the public and probably in reality that we were failing in New Orleans. There were things that were happening there that kind of defied imagination and questioned whether or not the government was really doing what they were supposed to. I got there a week after the storm came ashore. In about 4 or 5 days, we were able to stabilize the response, unify the effort, and kind of put the pieces together that would allow us to uh, go in a unified response. And then that Friday, Secretary Chertoff called me to Baton Rouge, where Mike Brown was headquartered. And on my way into the building, I talked to a woman that worked for FEMA, and she told me how proud she was of the response, how emotionally draining it was for her to deal with these people every day and then go back to her hotel room at night and then see her agency and her leader vilified on television, which was what was going on. And I looked in her eyes and I felt real compassion and empathy for that woman. So I went upstairs and Secretary Chertoff called me into the room and he said, "All right, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have a news conference in 30 minutes. You're going to relieve Mike Brown of the entire response coordination. He's going to go back and be the FEMA administrator." We then went out and did what was arguably the most uncomfortable press conference I've ever been involved in. And after that, Mike Brown stormed out, and a week later, he resigned as a FEMA administrator. Secretary Chertoff basically said, "You're in charge," and left. And I kept thinking about that woman.
Mhm.
So I put out a directive that everybody was in the building. It was called a joint field office in Baton Rouge, was to assemble on the first floor so I could talk to them. And there were thousands of people in this sprawling uh, complex that was there. And I got into this room. There were probably about 1,500, 2,000 people in it. I got on up on a desk with a loud hailer. I basically told them what had happened. And I said, I had to go back to New Orleans for about 24 hours and make sure everything's stable there so they can keep doing what they're doing that's working now. But I'm going to come back here. We'll widen the response. I looked out at a sea of faces and they looked just like that lady I'd spoken to. So I told them all, I said, I'm giving you two orders. Now, I didn't have the authority to give anybody any orders. But there's an old saying, you don't have sovereignty unless you can exert it. Um, so I said, first of all, you're to treat anybody you come in contact with that's been affected by this storm as if they were a member of your family, your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, whatever. If you do that, you're probably going to overdo from time to time what you're trying to do, but that's okay at this stage of the response. Once you're focused on treating these people like they're a member of your family. Then I said the second thing is if you do that, uh, it's not your problem. I gave you your order, and the people can deal with me if they don't have if they have a problem with that. And at that point, there was a collective sigh in the room, and some people started openly weeping. And I guess to put a short end on it, nobody had ever told them in very simple terms what the mission was. Nobody had ever given them a standard to think about what they were doing that could unify the response. And nobody had ever told them that somebody had their back.
Those are tremendous. I mean, just you got everybody on board. You met them where they were. You empowered them to do the job. You told them to be humans and to care about those people that they're trying to help. And as you say, you had their back, and you were the if somebody's got a problem, come to you. Um, that's that's tremendous. Other other than other than doing that, as you look back on that experience, almost 20 years ago, a little over 19 years ago. What are the lessons that you would say you learned from that experience?
Well, I think there's one overarching lesson, and I've talked to countless groups and people about this since the event. I didn't get sent down till a week after the storm came ashore, and in the week that transpired before I went down there, in my view, we were working on the wrong problem. We thought it was a hurricane. Hurricane came ashore, and it was decimated. The Gulf Coast was decimated. But in Mississippi and other places, there was a hurricane that came through it, wiped out cities, towns, extraordinary damage. New Orleans got put completely underwater. And what nobody realized was, this is Allen's terminology now. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was the equivalent of a weapon of mass effect used on the city, but without criminality. So there wasn't a terrorist to blame or anything else. Had that
Mhm.
happened, the federal government would have been in charge from the start. But under our system of government, under the 10th Amendment, all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And disaster response is a state responsibility with support pursuant to a disaster declaration from the federal government. Well, there was a disaster declaration, and forces were just flowing in. By the time I got down to the Gulf, there were 80,000 people spread around the Gulf. But the real problem was, as a result of what happened in New Orleans, they lost continuity of government.
Mhm.
They didn't have the capability, the resources, and the structure to take those resources and apply them to any kind of outcome or mission effect. And so a lot of forces were down there were self-deployed. I found fire groups that had come from other parts of the country that had moved into a grade school and raidily were trying to work what was going on around them. But the city lost all command and control and couldn't control what was going on in there. So what we had to do was create an organized, unified response that could impact the whole city, prioritize what we were doing, and then focus on that. And what I did was I sat down with the Joint Task Force Commander from U.S. Northern Command, General Russ Honore, of the state, local responders, the National Guard. We basically made a pact that we were going to work uh, commonly together, plan and execute together. We divided the city into sectors, and we assigned the sectors to different resources that were available, the 82nd Airborne and so forth. Then we started going through and stopping at every dwelling. You probably remember the markings with the circle and the X's,
Mhm.
um, to see if anybody still needed to be saved, or we had to deal with a really difficult issue of remains recovery. And over the course of the recovery, we made 3 sweeps through the city, looking for people to be saved or remains to be recovered. And once we got that all coordinated on a daily basis, the federal government would support state and local officers that had the authority to go into houses. We would provide logistics, rubber boats, communications, and we stabilized the response in 96 hours. Had we known when the storm came ashore that that was the problem, we could have fixed it a week earlier. But sometimes the complexity of the situation doesn't allow you to understand what's going on. That's the reason problem definition,
Mhm.
what really needs to be done, and what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve are critically important.
Two thoughts on that. I think, people quote Einstein as saying something to the effect of if he had an hour to save the world, um, he would spend 55 minutes figuring out what the problem was, before the last 5 minutes of arriving at a solution. The other thing I was wondering, and I guess this could be seen by some as sticky or what have you, but was the problem an issue with planning ahead of time, preparation, and or was it solely a recognition of actually what the problem was?
The answer is E, all of the above.
Okay, that's
Um,
that's what I was getting.
yeah, it's a mixture. It's kind of like a continuum. Uh, First of all, let's talk about the status of the city before the storm hit. Whenever you have a city that has large numbers of underserved communities,
Mhm.
they become less resilient when something happens. The storm itself didn't create the condition, but the extent you have childhood nutrition, you have service issues on maintaining social welfare and things like that. The storm doesn't create those conditions, but the conditions exacerbates the effect of the storm.
Mhm.
So the notion of what is the current status of the city or the area is really, really important. Um, Also, the planning and the execution and the structure available to local leaders is important for how they respond to it. In this case, The storm of record had never been this bad for New Orleans, and so they did not evacuate as much as they needed to. There were many cases where there were hundreds of buses that were in parking lots and ended up being flooded that could not be used. And people went to the Superdome because that's where you went for 24 hours and then went back home. And then the city was flooded and you couldn't get to the Superdome. So a lot of historical paradigms broke down.
Mhm.
And then when the city flooded from three sides, from Lake Pontchartrain, from the Industrial Canal, and then the storm surge itself, and flooded the city lost command and control of the fire and police. And then it was difficult for the mayor and the governor to actually coordinate a response. That's the reason it's everything. And when you're looking at how do you prepare in advance, resiliency is a multifaceted issue. In my view, it really starts with the vibrancy and the self sufficiency of the city itself, the services, and the people.
Yeah. You've been obviously involved in some of our largest scale crises in recent history, at least in the U.S. Always just sort of, as you alluded, being called in to clean up the mess after things are going sideways. And from all indicators, you've done a great job in those situations. In On the podcast, I always like to try to provide both sides of the story for our listeners. And so I was trying to think of crises I could share that exemplify what it looks like to handle something poorly. I was tempted to go with BP's handling of Deepwater Horizon, but instead I decided to talk about Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster there. So, and the Chernobyl disaster is often cited as one of the worst examples of crisis management. For those who remember, a reactor exploded due to operator error and design flaws, and the crisis response was marked by poor communication, secrecy, and misinformation spread by Soviet authorities. The emergency workers were not adequately briefed on the radiation risks, and officials delayed evacuating nearby residents, and that led to widespread exposure to radiation, numerous deaths, and long-lasting health impacts, many of which continue nearly 40 years later. So instead of getting the information out to all parties and acting quickly, the Soviets did pretty much all the wrong things for crisis management, and as a result, it was devastating. So I think it's always good to learn from the positive and hear the negative at the same time to see how to do it and how not to do it.
Yeah, I would add the Union Carbide accident at Bhopal, India, too.
Yes, that's a good one. Shifting gears a little bit, it's clear that crises are going to come, perhaps seemingly elementary question to ask you. Why is it important that leaders be good at crisis management? To that end, I mean, is it actually important that leaders be involved in crisis management when it happens?
No, that's a terrific question. Let me preface that by just a little bit of a background. When I was deployed for Hurricane Katrina, I was sent down there by Secretary Chertoff and President Bush. And basically, I was working directly for them to, quote, fix the problem. And sometimes when things are that complex and that's widespread, that's the mandate you get to fix the problem. Um, and then during the oil spill, I worked for Janet Napolitano and President Obama. And again, it was fix the problem. But there were two different problems that required a slightly different set of leadership skills, not only from the persons in charge of the response, but for political leaders. So when you talk about crisis leadership, I think I would make a separation. If you're a national leader, the CEO of a corporation, or the head of a large organization that is responsible for a response, your first duty is to run the organization. If you're the president, your first duty is to lead the nation, but you need to politically lead the response so you engender the confidence of the American people. And I was very, very lucky because under a Republican president and under a Democratic president, they assigned me the lead. They put me in charge. They gave me the ability to talk directly to the American people and to be transparent. But they both told me that I was accountable. And then from a political standpoint, they dealt with the general public. I did too. But as I told both of them and other people that I've talked about in the past, you need to assign a professional, the best expert you can, to run or manage the response. And then you need to run the country. And then I said, hold me accountable. And if I don't do a good job, fire me. You can't be the president and run the response at the same time.
Mm.
Anybody that's ever tried to do that has failed, which is what happened in Japan after the tsunami and the breakdown of their nuclear power plants. I remember
Mm.
sitting on a sofa with my wife and hearing the prime minister saying that he was in charge of the response. And I turned to my wife and I said, "Dead politician walking.
Yeah.
You can't do both, but you're responsible for everything."
That's an interesting reality. It reminds me of in Sun Tzu's Art of War. He talks about the emperor and the general, and basically the emperor needs to stay out of the, like when the general is sent to war, stay out of it. You know, you still have to be the figurehead, but you got to let this person do their job. And as you say, as the president, that person has to continue to be the president, which means a whole bunch of things other than just dealing with this immediate crisis. It means interacting with other nations about completely different things and so forth. So that's a great point, and hopefully maybe it's a point that, and I'm sure that's a part of the reason that you mention it. It's a point that people out there listening can appreciate, that just because the president doesn't land on Air Force One or Marine One or whatever the next day, it doesn't mean that that's not an important thing. It may mean that there are a whole lot of other things that, as a president, that the president has to do too.
Yeah, and there's a proper way to explain that to the American public, that while you're not present on scene, you're engaged, you know what's going on. And the communications at the political level and the communications at the operational level are both really important, but slightly different in that at the political level, you're trying to not only inform, but engender credibility and confidence in the American public that everybody's doing their job. That doesn't mean you have to be on scene, but you have to explain how it's being run, who's in charge, and what your role is, to the point where the people say, "We
Yes,
understand."
sir. Well, can you share an event from your career where it was imperative that you as the leader be the one at the helm of managing a crisis? Maybe one that's not as high profile as Katrina or so forth?
Yeah, there are actually a couple. The first ship I was assigned to when I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 1971 was in a dry dock that fall, and we had a fire on the ship, and I was trapped in a compartment with
Mm.
5 other people, and we weren't where the fire was happening, but all the smoke and flames from the fire was coming up through the ship and had us trapped where we were at. So the people fighting the fire didn't know we were there, and we had to figure out how to solve that problem. So we inside every ship there's insulation on the steel bulkheads to prevent condensation, sound, and everything else. We took our pocket knives and cut that insulation away and started beating SOS with a hammer that was in the space for. We were in the radio room and they had a hammer there for emergency destruction if you ever had to do that. So we were beating SOS and Morse code, and somebody in the dock happened to hear us. And ultimately, we were rescued. Somebody came in with an oxygen breathing apparatus and let us out. We could not done that by ourselves because we were disoriented and could not quickly move without out some assistance. So I came very close to dying that day. There was smoke down about 6 inches off the deck. We were all laying down with our hands held together when we saw the face come through the smoke that let us out. So some of the people had a real problem with what was going on. They were breakdown. They were crying. I was trying to figure out how to get us out of there and not accept the finality of the situation. So you always got to keep trying. And I said earlier, to learn something from every experience you've had. That was a life molding experience, and it happened 6 months after I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy.
Wow, that's harrowing.
We had a few adult beverages that night.
No doubt. I mean, I, I don't have anything to add other than that's a really profound story.
Well, 1 year later, in the December of 1972, we were in an apartment. We were on a ship, so we had one of these apartments where 5 guys are splitting the rent, and this is where you hang out and all that. And we got a call from somebody on the ship that there was a problem, and they asked us to go to the local Coast Guard air station because they were looking for volunteers. And I didn't know it at the time, but an Eastern Airlines Lockheed L-1011 had flown through the altimeter alarm, and basically on approach to the Miami airport, basically flew into the Everglades at full speed
Hmm.
because the pilots got disoriented and were trying to deal with a warning light, and they basically flew through the altimeter alarm that said they were lower than they should be. If you want to look it up, it's Eastern Airline Flight 401. It's everywhere on Wikipedia. We were in the second or third helicopter that went in, and we had dropped in to help with the ground rescue team as volunteers. And I spent the rest of the night and half the next day going through the wreckage looking for survivors, and I didn't find any. And that was a life forming experience as well.
Yeah. Admiral Allen, you just have a collection of just incredible, incredible, harrowing stories. I really appreciate you sharing those.
I tell everybody I'm like the Forrest Gump of the Coast Guard.
Well, I think now's a good time for me to touch on some of the science behind crisis and disaster management. For those who don't know, there's an entire field of study of these things, and obviously we can't cover all that here, but I wanted to share some high points. Several studies have shown that transformational and charismatic leadership styles are associated with better crisis management. In their study, Melissa Bowers and colleagues found transactional leaders do not perform well with crisis management, whereas transformational leaders are best for all types of crises. Similarly, strategic leadership practices improve crisis management. And multiple investigators have studied leadership competencies and found associations between specific ones and better crisis management. For instance, Wisigers and Singthai found, in addition to emergency preparedness, communication, emotional intelligence, and leadership skills were competencies associated with effective crisis management. Similarly, Capuccio and Uston found leaders marked by decisiveness, flexibility, and communication, as well as team building, motivating, and decision making, were better at crisis management. That last set reminds me of your story of standing there in this room in Baton Rouge and talking to those folks, and the impact that moment had certainly fits with those data. So, well, Admiral, you shared how you think about handling crises and why it's important for leaders to do so. I was wondering, for our listeners, those who want to improve their crisis management skills, what practical advice would you give them? Do you have a framework for how you deal with crisis, or a way that you think about it?
Well, that's really an interesting question, and I would just second the comments you just made. But I wouldn't single out one particular way of thinking about a problem. They're all important. Uh, if you treat all these different models and ways to think about it as a specific tool, let's say, you don't want a toolbox with just a screwdriver.
Sure.
You want as many different varied tools as you can, and then you need to know how to use them. That's the reason I don't prescribe to one particular leadership model,
Mm-hmm.
or the fact that leaders, whether they're made or born, everybody can be a better leader,
Yes,
in my
sir.
view. So I would say the first two elements are lifelong learning and emotional intelligence. Those are the cornerstones. Nothing happens without that. And whether it's tactical or strategic or whatever, you've got to have the ability to learn and grow over your lifetime. And you got to have the ability to involve other people and create teams that can be successful. Uh, but one of the things that I found useful over my lifetime, I had the opportunity back in the '80s to go to MIT. I was a Sloan Fellow. I think it's probably 30 or 40 years old, but Peter Senge wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline
Mm-hmm.
from MIT. It's been widely published. I used it in some teaching that I've done. But he's got a concept in there called mental models. And over my lifetime, based on the experiences that I've had, I've tried to figure out how do I, even if it's really rough and maybe not as inaccurate as you'd like it to be, can I create a model of what's going on as a way to create a framework and think about what I'm doing? It gives me a chance to test an idea and evolve my thinking. Now, I didn't give you a screwdriver or a hammer there. What I said was go to the toolbox and look for something that works. But you got to fill the toolbox first.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, this notion of creating mental models and then building what I would call an inventory of frameworks uh, is what I encourage people to do. And when I'm teaching leadership or I'm talking about it, that's what I do. I can give you a very, very simple example if you want.
Yes, sir. That'd be great.
So let's say, and I'm going to be real generic about this. Let's say you're in a situation, you can call it a crisis, whatever you want, but you have 30 minutes to make a decision. And you don't have a lot of input. There's not a lot of people around you. And so what you're having to do is make a very significant decision in a compressed time frame with incomplete information, which is usually what it is, right? So if you sit down and say, based on what I know, I don't know
Mhm.
everything. I'd like to know more, but based on what I know, I can do A, B, or C because that's where I have resources and ability to act. And the pros and cons of working with A versus B versus C. How do I mitigate risk? Blah, 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 blah. And you spend 15 minutes just doing that. It gets back to your statement about 15 minutes about me working, thinking about the problem.
Mhm.
And then you say, all right, I'm going to do A. So then you do A, and then you have a low probability, high consequence outcome. In other words, it goes south on you and you're not successful. Then the conversation is going to be about your model. What were the options? How much information you had? You know what it's not about? Your character. You didn't wing it. You did the best you could with what you had. That's a hell of a lot different than saying I had no choice, so I just reacted. There's a
Sure.
difference in those two things.
Yes, sir. As I'm listening there, what I hear is preparation, mental or cognitive or maybe emotional on some level, but being prepared, you create this framework, this model, having that in your pocket so that when something does arise, when a crisis does come, you've got that, you can pull it out of your toolbox, as you said, and use it. Um, so that's a thing that I'm hearing in addition to simply to actually having the model, is the fact that you've thought about this beforehand and you have some framework that you're going to work through it before the crisis strikes, because otherwise you will just be, as you say, just reacting, just winging it.
Then it becomes a question of your character, and you don't ever want that to be the question.
Yes, sir.
Your character should not be the issue. Is how well you tried to create a model and make a decision under the best conditions you could, and what were the elements that went into that.
Yeah, this idea of being prepared. I was just I was just thinking about that. I interviewed for my study. I interviewed General Tony Zinni, and you probably know him. Uh,
I do.
he said that you never fight the wars you're prepared for, and so in my study of crisis management and so forth, it seems to me that one of the things that people constantly talk about is this idea of excellent preparation is the biggest key to it. Obviously, some of the things that you've had to that you've had to come in and clean up on, it's hard to imagine the preparation in a sense. I mean, with Deepwater Horizon, obviously, if the engineering and the maintenance and all those things that led to the event had been taken care of and preparation was made on that, it would have never happened. If there are a lot of ifs in with Katrina and that, but as far as it pertains to how to be prepared, other than having this model, do you have any other kind of practical tips?
Sure. And I'm probably misquoting it, but I think it was General Eisenhower that said, "Plans are nothing. Planning is everything." Because as Tony Zinni said, you never fight the war you prepared for. But in the process of writing the plans, you create relationships, mental models, and you can get different inputs, and you're better prepared to move forward by going through the planning process, even if the plan itself doesn't apply directly to what you're doing. That's just an extension of what he said. But this happens at different levels. Let me just give you a personal example.
Yes, sir.
Let's say a household, right? In your household, and this is not hard to do, you don't have to be a prepper or anything. You should be able to stay in your house for 72 hours if something happens and you're not forced out of it. Loss of power, lack of communication, lack of access, on food, medicine, whatever.
Hmm.
You should be able to stay in your house for 72 hours. What's the upshot of that? Well, if you can stay in your house for 72 hours until you're either assisted or something happens, first of all, you're not putting a demand signal on response forces so they can
Mm.
move to a higher mission and save other people. Number two, you're in a position because you got food, water, medicine, whatever it is, you can actually help your neighbor. And if you can think about it, this starts to create a virtuous cycle in a community or a neighbor. And then the final thing is you're competent and able to carry out the directions of your city leaders, whether it's to evacuate, stay in place, or whatever they want you to do. You have the wherewithal to cooperate with the higher levels of government. So if you kind of take that paradigm as an individual and you move it up to communities, counties, and states, there's a certain baseline level. I talked to a lot of people after Hurricane Katrina. I equate that type of a resiliency and readiness to the civic equivalent of immune system.
Hmm.
If you've got a strong immune system and you get a virus or you get sick or something like that, you're impacted by it, but you get through it quicker and you get on with your life. To the extent you have pre-existing conditions and you're not resilient at the individual level or the community level, then it's like getting COVID without having the vaccine. If you get COVID having the vaccine, you're going to live, but it's going to be uncomfortable. If you haven't had the vaccine, you got a high chance that you're not going to survive. So I kind of take that paradigm and just move it up to government.
That's great. That is that is really great. The three parts of that, and then the ability to scale it, if you will, from the individual to the community and beyond. As I was reviewing the literature and thinking about crisis management, I identified what I would say 8 do's and 10 don'ts of crisis management, and I'll kind of walk through those, and I'd be interested to get your take on it, but I thought they might be helpful for our listeners. So the 8 do's are initial crisis best practices, if you will, that come from an author named Timothy Coombs, who studied this and spent years looking at crisis management. Number 1 is be quick and try to have initial response within the first hour. Number 2, be accurate by carefully checking all facts, recognizing there's going to be some things you don't know. Number 3 is be consistent by keeping spokespeople informed of crisis events and key message points. Number 4, make public safety the number 1 priority. Number 5, use all the available communication channels. 6 is provide some expression of concern and or sympathy for victims. Number 7 is remember to include your team members and those people who perhaps even are affected in the initial response. And number 8 on the do's is be ready to provide stress and trauma counseling to the victims of the crisis and their families. And don't forget the employees and people that are involved, because there's a lot of stress and post-traumatic stress that can come from that, from those sorts of events. So those are the 8 do's, if you will. Any thoughts on those, Admiral, before I jump on the don'ts?
Well, I'll save something for the end once you do both, but what you just said translates into 2 things in my view: transparency and accountability.
Yes, sir.
Um, I I had my hip replaced in March, and I was laying in the hospital room. My cell phone went off, and it was Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought to ask him how in the hell he got my number, but he was asking what I thought about what was going on and did I have any recommendations. And you mentioned earlier I was consulted during the Key Bridge disaster. When I got down to, after we talked about a number of things, one thing I said was, I think at some point you need to take the families of the men that were lost and actually take them out there, whether it's to throw flowers in the water, to have some kind of a moment of silence, but give them as much closure as you can based on what happened. And that's one of the things the expression of a concern and sympathy for victims. So a couple of weeks later, actually it was longer than that, when they finally reconciled and recovered all the remains, and they knew exactly what had happened with the people that were trapped on the bridge when it collapsed. Um, Wes Moore did something that was remarkable. He made a video to the families, and he did it entirely in Spanish because all of the workers were Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a better example of your concern and sympathy for victims than the extraordinary empathy and leadership that Wes Moore showed in making a video in their language,
Yeah.
expressing his sorrow and concern for the families. So that's the gold standard.
Yeah. Well, and and that is, it's that sort of thing where people just miss, right? Like it'd be it'd be the kind of thing where if somebody did that, but it was in English and half the family maybe didn't speak English, then they don't get it. And there's just, so yes, great on his part. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And there you were in the hospital, having just undergone a hip. Oh, you get called at the best times, huh?
Like I said, I don't know how he got my number, but he had it. So.
Well, let me go on to the 10 don'ts of crisis management. Number 1, don't speculate publicly about what you do not know. Hey, look, that just for our listeners and anybody else, probably that should just be a rule of life, period, whether it's crisis management or not. Let me repeat that. Don't speculate publicly about what you do not know. Number 2, don't minimize the problem to the press. If it is serious, they're going to find out. Number 3, don't let the story dribble out. Each new fact will bring a headline. Number 4, don't let the lawyers run the show. They will only protract the operation and management will no longer be seen to be in control. Number 5, don't blame anyone for anything. Number 6, don't get rational. Address emotional issues. They're what the press will print. Number 7, don't release information about people which will violate their privacy. Number 8, don't say no comment because it makes you and your organization look guilty even though you may not be. You can explain why you cannot comment at the precise moment, and that could be that investigations are pending or in progress, next of kin have not been notified, things of that nature. Whatever the reason, never make an off-the-record comment. Everything is always on the record. Number 9, don't play favorites among the news media. And number 10, don't use the opportunity to promote your organization or your products or your services, whatever it may be. So those are the 10 don'ts. I think for a lot of us, they make sense, but time after time, we've seen people violate those. So obviously for some people, they don't make sense. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I'll start out with one that I tell everybody. Lawyers advise, commanders decide. At the end of one of my classes, because I had met him in a restaurant in a bar in New Orleans, I had James Carville come in and talk to my
Oh,
class.
yeah.
Yeah, as you know, he's quite the character.
Yeah.
And then at the end of my class, I had everybody write down a catastrophic event, a Chernobyl, a Bhopal, Deepwater Horizon, just an event that worst event they could think of. Then they folded them up in little pieces of paper, and I put them in a ball cap, and I shook them up, and I turned around and I pulled one of them out, and then I turned around and I said, "Okay, I'm the spokesperson for the president, and I've got this piece of paper, and I'm walking out. It's like 6 in the morning, but we called the press in anyway. That happened over the night, and I'm going to talk to him." And so I did some role playing, and I'm a lousy actor, but bear with me. And so I said, "Thank you all for getting up early and coming in here. We're very appreciative that you're here to help us explain to the American public what's going on and what the president is doing." The president was awoken at 4 in the morning and was told what was happening. We're on a schedule now where we're briefing him every hour on what's going on, and I will be out here every 2 hours to give you an update about what's happening. The president and the first lady have expressed their condolences for the losses of the families. This is a horrific event, somewhat historic in nature, but all the elements of support and power in the United States are being brought to bear to deal with the problem. And I went on and on and on and on. And then I just stopped and I looked at them all. I said, "What was the event?"
Didn't say.
I said, "I never opened the paper."
Right.
The case closed, man.
Yeah.
Be transparent, be accountable, tell the truth. If you can't tell the truth, tell them why. And as you noted, if there's a security, medical, or privacy reason, say that. Say what the reason is that you can't do it, but don't leave them wondering. And I was in the White House press room briefing them one time during Deepwater Horizon, and I got a question from one of the reporters about uh, why didn't we take over the spill and replace BP, because they were never going to do what's right. They were trying to just minimize the damage to them. And I stepped forward and I put out my hands and I said, "And replace them with who or what?" Because they own the well and the means to cap it.
Mm-hmm.
Then I stepped back for about 5 seconds and I leaned forward again, put my hands out again, but I didn't say anything. And Helen Thomas was sitting in the front row. She used to be the dean of White House reporters. She'd been there for years. She's passed away now. And she just looked up and said, "He's good."
Well, that's a compliment.
I took that as a passing grade.
Well, Admiral Allen, before we wrap up, any other closing thoughts, parting shots that you have?
Transparency and accountability. I was extraordinarily lucky in that two presidents, Republican and a Democrat, let me speak directly every day on a schedule to the American people. And there were only a couple of times where somebody tried to influence what I said or wanted me to do something. And when those staffers tried to intervene for political or public affairs purposes, I threatened to go to the president, and it never happened again. But I'm not sure everybody gets uh, that wiggle room and the ability to do their job. But it gets back to what I said earlier. Presidents need to be the president, and crisis leaders need to be crisis leaders, and they need to be held accountable to the president. And the president needs to be the political leader for the country.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that. We'll end on that note. Admiral Allen, it has been an honor to have you on the Science of Leadership today. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.